Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sean Mooring, Program Director at the Linfest Institute for Journalism and a proud member of the J Funder Planning Committee for this event. It's my job this afternoon to set the context for our plenary session, Rebuilding Journalism by Centering Racial Equity at its Core. And you may ask, why this, why now? When we think about it, the pandemic is ongoing. We have continuing political divisiveness and partisanship continues to rule the day. And despite the global reckoning, too many of our media organizations still do not reflect the communities they serve, whether in leadership coverage or within the journalists on their staff. We also know that representation matters. And that our philanthropic institutions have also fallen short in serving as the catalyst for advancement in these areas. And so today we're excited to hear from both some funders and practitioners who are leading the charge of inclusiveness and equity in their respective communities. Today we'll be hearing from Malkia Devich-Cyril of MediaJustice, who will provide a brief overview of the history and impact of systemic racism on journalism and also be the moderator for our panel. Our panelists will include Lolly Bowean, Media and Storytelling Portfolio Manager at the Field Foundation in Chicago, Sandy Clark, Vice President for News and Civic Dialogue at WHYY here in Philadelphia, Molly Deguar, President of the Independent Public Media Foundation, also here in Philadelphia, and Ade Emanuel, Editor of Injustice Watch in Chicago. We'd also like this to be a very engaging session and therefore encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions of the panelists and moderator as the session is ongoing. At this time, I will pass you over to into the very capable hands of Malkia, and they will share with you the session structure and get us started. Malkia?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today to have this important conversation with you. I'll share a little bit about, exactly what was just described, and then we'll hear from two funder practitioner pairs about some actual solutions, some interventions that are happening in their community and what they're doing about some of the problems that we see. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And let's see here. All right, I hope that you can see what I see. But again, my name is Malkia Devich-Cyril, and I am the founding and former executive director of the organization MediaJustice. Started it from the Youth Media Council in 2001 and continued to be its executive director until 2019. To give you a little bit of context about what my perspective and what I'm sharing with you today, my mom, named Janet Cyril, was the editor of the Black Panther newspaper. She was also the coordinator of the free breakfast program of the Harlem chapter of the BPP. She sent me and my sister to Freedom Schools, taught us to read on the floor of Liberation Bookstore in Harlem. And later, she became an educator responsible for coordinating the educational services delivered to all inmates and detained adults in New York City. So she did that because she believed then, as I believe now, that the American media is a reflection of this nation, but not a reflection of the people that it's supposed to serve. Because I think that American journalism mirrors the inequalities of American society. For the last 20 years, I've worked to close racial and economic equity gaps in media and technology in order to build narrative power for BIPOC communities across the U.S. and to use narrative strategies to achieve racial equity and justice. So this is definitely an honor to be here today to be able to continue to be in service of that work. Briefly, I'd love to share just a few thoughts with you about how I see and how I think systemic racism has warped American journalism, estranged it from democracy, put it in the service of inequality, and directed it to harm BIPOC communities. With your grace, I'd also like to chat a little bit about the role philanthropy has played in exacerbating some of these conditions, and about the role philanthropy could play in transforming these conditions, because we all know that we are here today because our commitment is transformation. Our commitment is around justice. So I know that you probably, you're all brilliant people, have been in this work for some time. You've probably heard a lot of this information before. I'm a firm believer that we can sit around and talk about problems all day, but in fact, it's the solutions that lead us in the direction that we want to go in. And that the real issue at the end of the day is about building the institutional will to make the kinds of investments that will lead to the transformations that we believe are necessary. So, first thing that we have to do, actually, let me go back. The first thing that we need to do when we are thinking about dealing with systemic racism in journalism is we have to acknowledge that systemic racism exists, that it's real. Let me ask you a question. Just take a moment, and if you have access to the chat in your world, I don't know what interface you're on, but I want to ask you, do you trust the news media? Do you trust what you read? Do you trust what you see? Do you trust what you hear? We've spent many years now, at least 4 years in the Trump era, that where journalism has been the subject of battering, right? Of battering and suspicion and mistrust. And, so I want to ask you, do you trust the news media? Look, a 2019 Pew report revealed that 1 in 3 Black people in the United States actually said they have a lot of trust in the information they get from local news organizations. Now, I think that's interesting because, as the if you will, victims of criminalization in the media, I was surprised to read, how much Black folks trust news media. But I think what the key is here is from local news organizations, right? It's much higher than the share of whites who say the same. That was about 27%. When it comes to national news organizations, Black folk were about at 23%, and they were as likely as white folks and as Latinos to express a lot of trust. And that was all pretty low, actually. 27%, 23%, 20%. Basically, public trust in journalism is at an all-time low. Now, some of this is because of the battering that I just described, and some of this is because of its generations-long historic structural racism problem, So, in 2020, in September 2020, a Gallup poll said that 9% in the United States trust mass media a great deal. 9%. Come on. That's not very much. 31% a fair amount, 27% not very much, and 33% none at all. That's pretty low trust, The percentage with no trust at all is actually at a record high, up 5 points since 2019. In May 2020, Black Lives Matter activists also demonstrated that they agree with this assessment, right? Protesters, as you might remember in Atlanta, mounted the CNN building. I'm actually going to go back to this picture right here. And raised Black Lives Matter flags and stood on top of there in protest. Now, news reports of this moment said protesters attacked the building. Now, I wonder what it would be like if we could understand that actually maybe the building attacked them, attacked the protesters, attacked Black people, both symbolically and materially. Then this standing atop this, confronting this building was actually perhaps an act of self-defense, right? A desperate attempt to alert the world to the complicity of news media in facilitating and justifying white supremacy, structural racism, and specifically anti-Blackness. Now, protesters, I think, confronted that building because they remembered coverage of every high-profile killing of a Black body by police. and how the same police departments responsible for those murders were then considered official sources in those murders. They climbed and they planted that flag because they witnessed how news media failed to adequately counter the pandemic misinformation being spread through social media that particularly targeted Black and Latinx communities, and directly contributed to unequal deaths and unequal distribution of resources. They remember the same kind of misinformation, disinformation, targeting Black communities, targeting Muslim and Arab communities, targeting Latinx communities during the election seasons, both 2016 and 2021. They remember the coverage of Standing Rock and the depiction of the brutality and lawlessness of indigenous protesters without adequate investigation into the paramilitary forces attacking those protesters. Those protesters standing atop the CNN, logo, they remember how coverage of immigration almost never includes Black migrants and almost always is about quote unquote illegal immigration. They remembered the coverage of Katrina and how, according to CNN, Black people were looting and white people were finding food and supplies as they all tried to survive the storm. They remember the ad Donald Trump posted at the New York Times and the Daily News, in the New York Post and the New York Newsday, saying that he wanted to hate these little muggers and murderers, and that talking about the Central Park Five. I remember. I was a child, a young person back then, and I remember when the ad said they should be forced to suffer, and when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes. See, I think Black people remember that those newspapers had no qualms taking that money and placing that ad. The protesters put a little hurting on that CNN building in Atlanta because of the historic uses of the mainstream press to capture escaped enslaved Africans in colonial times during chattel slavery, to call for our deaths, to justify all manner of harms against us, including mass incarceration. And when during American Reconstruction, when Black folk and other folk built alternative presses, alternatives to the mainstream press system, guess what? They burned them down. So the bottom line is, I think, to open this up with an understanding that when these protesters attack that news station, when Black protesters say, no, they don't want to talk to journalists, this increasing antagonism between Black communities and the press is not simply some ahistoric, short-term, misdirected anger. It's a righteous rage. It's grounded in history. And most importantly, it's a collective experience of generational betrayal by this fourth estate, right? This U.S. media system framed as this beacon of freedom and democracy, which also participated in the political economy of slavery and continues to participate in the political economy of white supremacy in a digital age. That's where we are right now. And so 21st century efforts to confront and transform racial hierarchy and inequality in journalism are threatened, right, by five major factors. We know that there are great journalists out here. We know that there are funders out here that want to make a difference. And here are some things that we need to think about and things that kind of get in our way. One, we need to really consider the impact of the whole digital transition on journalism. I'm sure that there's going to be, and there either have been or there will be, plenty of talks about that, so we'll just leave that there. Deregulation and the history of legal and regulatory barriers to BIPOC ownership and content, from the Federal Communications Commission to the Federal Trade Commission, have in fact limited racial equity and justice in journalism. For example, in 1995, the Republican-controlled Congress passed legislation to end the FCC's minority tax certification program, which had helped increase broadcast station ownership by people of color from 1% to 3% since 1978. So they eliminated that. That is a structural change that reduced the ownership, broadcast ownership by people of color. Also, this change transformed journalism's economic model And, the digital transition has simultaneously siloed and sidelined available resources for diversity and inclusion, equity and racial justice in journalism. We know that the 1996 Telecom Act had a unique impact. We know that racialized disinformation has a unique impact. We know that the dangerous expansion of right-wing media has a unique impact. And let me just say a word or two about that. So we know that conservatives spent most of the 1950s establishing their own media outlets in direct backlash to this growing civil rights movement. And I say this because we're in a civil rights movement today, and we are experiencing similar backlash right now. In that time, in the 1950s, publications like the National Review, publications like Human Events, publishing houses like Regenery and Devin Adair, all right-wing outlets, broadcasts like the Mannion Forum and Dan Smoot Report. They were all initiated during this time, and they organized throughout that period, and related conservative lawmakers and activists are now kind of carrying that forward in this concerted assault against what they call critical race theory, right? That includes a wide range of efforts and ideas about the history of racial injustice and white supremacy in the United States, how it's embedded in American law, economy, and society, and the resulting inequalities and conditions observed today. What I'm trying to get at is, on the surface, it might seem like attacks on critical race theory have little to do with transforming journalism, but in reality, this organized right-wing movement is engaged in a cultural battle about racism that does a few things that make it very hard to move an agenda for racial equity and racial justice in journalism. One, this right-wing movement denies the existence of racism, and part of the goal is to ensure that there's no basis for change, right? So that this idea that structural racism simply doesn't exist. Two, it makes it interpersonal and therefore neutral, conditional, and raceless, meaning that anybody can be racist against anybody. And so people of color and BIPOC communities cannot, this idea of benefit and privilege to white communities and harm to communities of color disappears under those conditions. And three, it advances explicit white supremacist beliefs and narratives as part of like a larger content battle through official and unofficial mechanisms. There was a report recently, actually, by Media Matters that suggested that the rhetoric of the white supremacist extremists is both intensifying and it's more widespread. So we are in a period of backlash today, just as in the 1950s and 60s, media journalism was in a period of racial backlash then. I think it's important to consider that in order to rebuild journalism into this transformative watchdog and information system we all want it to be, one that is explicitly anti-racist, there are some ways that we need to think about this change. We need to think about diversity and inclusion efforts, right? These are institutional efforts. We need to think about equity in journalism as systemic efforts. And we need to think about racial justice policies and larger changes as structural efforts, institutional, systemic, structural. You notice that none of this is individual. Now, I want to just share that a lot of focus has been on these training programs, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think training has its place, but just like when we seek to train the police, and not to say that journalists and the police are anything like each other, but the point is that these are systems that need to change. These are institutions that need to change, and the individuals and their individual behavior within those systems will change when the systems change, and not the other way around. And, that's a controversial perspective. So I'd love to actually hear what you have to say about that in the chat. Please take a moment. Think about your questions. I'd love it if you could write them down right quick while I tell you a little bit of a story. So my friend, Naomi Ishizaka, she's a journalist at the Seattle Times. And like many journalists of color, especially women and LGBTQ journalists, has been a pretty consistent victim of online abuse. The same treatment happens overwhelmingly to activists of color, especially Black women, and the studies support this. You can double check me, Snopes me. In Naomi's case, audience members who were displeased with her social justice column at the Seattle Times went and altered her Wikipedia page to suggest that she had been actually convicted of attempted murder and imprisoned, which was not true. But it quickly went from just a Wikipedia page to where Google had created a knowledge panel. So when you Googled her, it talked about her actual work as well as this false conviction for attempted murder, right? Plus some other supposed fake aliases. When you do searches for her name, that stuff still comes up, even though she went through Wikipedia to get it taken down, went through Google to get it taken down. And when you look up her name, it still says, who did Naomi Ishizaki shoot? Even though no such shooting occurred. The point is here that, I think about her, and I think about the brutal arrest of CNN correspondent Omar Jimenez during that live shot in Minneapolis. Y'all remember that? Or I think about the fact that journalists covering the pandemic or any physical manifestation of systemic racism against members of their own community face unique risks and harms. They become what Judith Butler called, the author Judith Butler called vulnerable witnesses. Now I ask you, what kind of a newsroom can retain that journalist? What needs to happen for a newsroom to retain that journalist? See, that is more complicated than simple training programs. That is even more complicated than just pathways to entry-level jobs. Look, in 2018, Pew found that newsroom employees were less diverse than the U.S. workforce overall. Over 77%, in fact, of American newsrooms are made up of non-quote Hispanic white employees. In 2018, the Washington Post newsroom was 28.92% people of color, and where the city itself is 55% people of color. We already know, y'all know better than anybody, pay equity and transparency remain issues. The absence of Black representation in these positions of power can lead to content that is both hostile to people of African descent and ignores other folk like indigenous folk, Asian American folk, Arab and Muslim folk. Outlets need to balance, of course, perspective, identity, and experience, but the fact of the matter is diversity and inclusion efforts, when we're dealing with, for example, content-focused grants, they require structural elements. They require general operating funds that flow to the lowest paid journalists on the staff, which are almost always people of color and women. We have to stop talking about these issues as purely as individual and interpersonal issues. We talk about privilege and bias in these erroneous interpersonal ways. Diversity and inclusion programs, they so often focus on awareness, or they focus on creating pipelines from journalism schools into these, like I said, entry-level positions. But what if they focused on not just these hiring, these kind of lower-level hiring practices, but what if they focused on shifting dynamics of power in the newsroom? What if they focused on complicating racial narratives by acknowledging perspective, by moving programs that actually sought to end the discrimination at these structural levels? I'm talking about pay transparency. I'm talking about higher level leadership positions, changes that expanded opportunity for BIPOC leadership in newsrooms. We can create these diversity initiatives that can actually create genuine pipelines to senior leadership positions. And I think that is it's pretty significant. And in order to do that, we have to think, like when we think about bias in terms of reporters, if we can think about it not as individual bias, but as institutional bias, newsrooms can recognize that being oppressed by a racial caste system is not a political position. So Black folk reporting on issues concerning Black people is not overly political. Getting clear on that can reduce the ways in which news media can be weaponized. And I think that is pretty critical. In the second kind of arena, right, we're talking about equity. We're talking about disrupting content bias and supporting content battles. Now, I know that we all know stories have a powerful impact on the brain. Stories can inspire empathy, they can teach community values, they can foster a sense of belonging, they can move us to action. We know that. But we also know, I think, as folks who are committed to big social change, that content is just the tip of a structural iceberg. Content audits throughout the 1990s, I mean, let's be clear, content and story is important. So let's talk about it, right? Content audits throughout the 1990s, throughout the 2000s, all the way to today, for example, reveal the manner in which both regular routines of press coverage, the regular routines, and routines are a result of systemic problems. So the regular routines of press coverage and the differential press treatment of, for example, Black communities compared to white communities leads to distortion in coverage of race and crime. This is something that we all already know. This is not new information, right? And yet somehow we still need to produce a lot of studies to confirm that. So let's just be clear. The studies revealed the tendency for mainstream news media to disproportionately portray poverty as a Black problem as well, finding that Black people were the dominant visual image, and stories about poverty even suggested that poverty is concentrated amongst Black people. So much so that one study even found that merely showing a Black person on the screen appeared to be code for involvement of poor people. This is how news media has correlated Black faces to poverty and to crime. We know this. A 2014 study by the Sentencing Project found, the same thing around crime. A 2017 study by Black advocacy group Color of Change and Family Story found the same thing. 2018 Kaiser Family Foundation report found the same thing. 2018 Center for American Progress did a poll that found that both national and local media over-report violent crime. And as a result, there exists this dangerous racialization of crime in American news media. Let me just pause for a minute. Let's just take that in, the corruption of public opinion that is the direct result of how of the structural problems in journalism. I say all of this because this is not an intellectual exercise, nor is it something that we need to care about for the simple sake of caring about it. The media systems, structural racism inside of our media systems has deadly consequences. The consequences are deadly, right? And transforming structurally racist content requires equity strategies that go far beyond diversity and inclusion. So I want to share, the Philanthropic Initiative on Racial Equity. I'm a fellow there, and we came out with a recent report. And the way we talk about equity at PRE is we talk about equity as the prevention of harm and the redistribution of benefits within existing systems. So I want to be clear. I want to talk about so some of the content changes are an equity strategy. They are about preventing harm and about redistributing benefit within the existing system. Make sense? And so we need to think about, right, how we prevent harm, how we make institutional changes in terms of policies and practices. Free Press's Media 2070 and other projects like that are about redistributing benefits. There are strategies afoot. And we are lucky that there are people so brilliant out here thinking about them. We also need to think about changing how we think about official stories, thinking about sources. Let me ask you, there's a quote here: "Those who commit the murders write the reports." Now, I don't know if you know who said that. I thought it was Malcolm X, but it's not. It was Ida B. Wells. It was Ida B. Wells talking about lynching. And, you know, what she said then is as true today as it ever was. You know, this question of uh, law enforcement perspectives being offered to journalists as facts and being translated by journalists as facts to a broader audience. This is something that it is not enough to simply ask journalists to stop. We actually need to provide the resources and the infrastructure needed to shield reporters from retaliation and to give them the power to actually do something different. So again, I challenge the idea that structural racism in journalism and transforming those structures, that it is a behavioral change. It is not. These are systemic changes. These are structural problems that require structural solutions. And I suggest that we think about those structural solutions in terms of the idea of targeted universalism. You know, what's good for those at the margins most often is good for everybody. You know, we saw that in the 50s and 60s when affiliate WLBT in Mississippi, you know, was on the air employing no black people, neither on camera or behind the scenes, even though its audience was more than 40% black. We know that station became the first one to lose its license, you know, because of its rabid defense of segregation. You know, that case though didn't just benefit black people or the civil rights movement. That case actually established the precedent that the public could participate in FCC matters, a right that was not the public did not hold before the decision in 1966. That precedent led to the formation of public interest communications law firms, you know, and all kinds of. It actually led to the birth of the media policy movement, a civil rights case that supposedly was about black people benefited the entire nation and all involved. So this is the idea of targeted universalism. When we take action that benefits those most impacted by harms, we actually benefit everybody. And so these are some of the ways that we can think about. And I want to just share with you this idea. When we talk about structural problems and structural solutions, we're talking about we're talking about more than diversity and inclusion. We're talking about more than equity, right? We're talking about this what's underneath that that iceberg, right? So we saw the tip of the iceberg, the content. We saw what's just underneath the iceberg, these inequities. And now further underneath that, I'm talking about the structure. I'm talking about the superstructure. I'm talking about ownership. I'm talking about access that then I'm talking about regulation and policy. All of that moves into content and then into new culture and new conditions. So we have to understand that to transform journalism, we actually have to change laws. We actually have to be willing to rethink and think about how does the First Amendment need to be adapted for a digital age? How do we think about some of these more fundamental questions that we consider sacrosanct in this time? I think that if we're going to find structural solutions, we got to admit and acknowledge that these problems are structural. There's been all this talk about white supremacy. Let's be clear what white supremacy is, right? It's not interpersonal racism between people. It isn't just the diversity and inclusion issues. You know, it's the political and socioeconomic system that allows white people at both the collective and individual level to enjoy structural advantage and rights that other racial and ethnic groups do not. And so when we think about white supremacy in journalism, I want to suggest that we tend to focus on the harms to communities of color, but I think we need to also focus on the privileges and the benefits conferred upon whiteness within journalism. I think if we were to examine that, we would actually come to see new potential economic base for journalism. We would come to understand some of the practices and social policies within journalism that ensure racial hierarchy, that safeguard ruling class processes, there is a benefit to shifting our gaze from harms to benefits, to privileges. And what is revealed when we are able to do that? I think that it will reveal at a deeper level the structural and material problems that are impacting many aspects of journalism, not simply the narrative, not simply the equity, but deeper into the ground. I think that it will force us, for example, to struggle with this perceived dissonance between the concept of objectivity and neutrality and the work of actively opposing racism and white supremacy by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life that reduce racial inequality. Check this out. On the one hand, journalism strives for supposed neutrality, supposed objectivity. On the other hand, here we are together talking about how to be anti-racist within, how to make anti-racist shifts within journalism. There's a dissonance there that we're going to have to struggle with. We're going to have to struggle with it. And to do that, it's going to require new laws. It's going to require a new economic base. And it's going to require new relationships between journalism and existing institutions and systems that shape BIPOC life in America. I'm talking about with prisons, with hospitals, with schools, etc. I'm not going to get into the digital transformation, the digital transition, and what that has all meant. I do think that we need to understand, obviously, that the pervasiveness of the internet is related to the defunding of journalism, and that the relationship here has blurred the lines between audience and journalists. Right? We know that since 2004, more than 1 in 5 local newspapers in the U.S. is closed. We understand that consolidation and corporatization has pushed people of color out and has concentrated the criminalization and demonization as well. We know that some of the results, when we talk about personalized news, when we talk about the hyper local, hyper niche, news, when we talk about citizen journalism, right? Again, these blurred lines. When we talk about the fact that media is increasingly mobile and journalism consumption has changed. We talk about artificial intelligence replacing journalists. We talk about news bubbles on demand. All of this stuff. Whether we're talking about the relationship between fixed media, connected media, which is spreading messages faster than traditional media. All of this is code.
Thank you. Well, Malkia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do need to try and get to the panelists.
All right, I'll just finish this sentence right here, which is the last thing that I was going to say anyway. It's code for white supremacy. That is the point. That all of that language is code for white supremacy, and we need to be thinking about that as we try to make changes. Let me share this last image with you here, and I encourage you to reach out and look at the mismatched report, Philanthropy's response to the call for racial justice, because I think that it speaks to a lot of what funders are struggling with around funding racial justice, both in journalism and beyond. I won't go through these 5. You can check that out yourself, but I think that this will help to keep the conversation rich moving forward, and help funders think about what kinds of interventions you can make to match the call from the movement, the call also from journalists, to your actual grants and grant strategies. So with that, I want to say thank you, and thanks for letting me know that my time was up. I appreciate that. And I want to share that now we're going to hear from 2 funder practitioner pairs on how they are implementing and supporting reforms in their communities. I want to invite, let me just go ahead and stop this share real quick. And I want to go ahead and invite Ade and Lolly Bowean, Media and Storytelling Portfolio Manager at the Field Foundation. And Ade, come on, editor of Injustice Watch. If you can have your cameras on here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and invite you 2 into a conversation. Thank you so much, and it's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Malkia, for setting the framework for this conversation and just really laying out the facts so honestly and so deeply and so real. I'm very grateful to be here. Ade, welcome. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you today.
Same. Good afternoon, everyone. And Lolly, I'm excited to chat. And yeah, this is great.
Well, let's just get started really quickly. Ade, why don't you start by telling the audience a little bit about Injustice Watch and its history, just so that they know what your publication is.
Of course, yeah. So Injustice Watch, which you can find at injusticewatch.org, is an organization founded in 2015 to cover abuses in, I think, institutional injustice, abuses in the court system, in corrections, especially in the legal system and in policing, but we especially focused on judges and the judiciary in Cook County and put together a judicial election guide every election that helps address what I think is a big structural inequity in a lot of ways, and how the folks who have so much power over people's lives, people who sit on the bench who are in the judiciary, they have so much power, but there's not as much accountability as there should be, and there's not as much information about these individuals. So when you see a list of 60 people and you're supposed to say yes or no, and it's a tough choice to make, and who has time to do all the research? So the founders, Rick Toski, Rob Warden, they really saw a need, a huge gap that they wanted to fill in the spirit of, I think, public service journalism as well as investigative journalism. So that is that's sort of Injustice Watch in a nutshell. And today we're still evolving and I think doing that work and more.
And so we know that the criminal justice system kind of disproportionately impacts particularly Black and Latino families and residents, which is the majority of our city. So in many ways, Injustice Watch shines a light on the people who are in charge of that criminal justice system. And therefore, the people who you are kind of serving is the Black and Brown communities in Chicago. Would you agree with that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put all those words in your organization's profile.
I agree that in its purest form, that is the implication. I think that in the past, sometimes it's felt like some of our work maybe was more insidery than it was for some of the folks who actually worked in the system, and not as much the people who were impacted by it, though I can't say that universally, but that we're definitely positioned right at the nexus of all those issues that land disproportionately on Black and Brown lives and communities. So it's, we talk about public service, there's a high bar to, I think, produce something that's useful to the community that suffered these harms. And when you talk about, service, I think we're doing a better job now of listening to what's of value to folks. But those are the folks that we're trying to, I think, reach out to more and more and listen to and pass the mic to more and more.
Yeah, so it's not just an inside conversation. And I'm going to shift back to that technique of listening to the community and listening and sort of telling stories in a new and unique way. But before we skip to that, you were appointed to the position of editor-in-chief, and you're the first Black man, a person of color, to kind of hold this role. Can you tell us, what did you immediately see that needed adjusting in your newsroom, and how did you start to make those sort of shifts, those corrections?
Okay, it's a good question. So I arrived as a reporter maybe a year before, and maybe 5-6 months later was an editor and then editor-in-chief by last December. And it's a fast sort of rise, I suppose. And so I say that to make the point that the issues that I saw, I didn't just see sort of, when I became editor-in-chief, it was something that was very apparent in that I was the only journalist of color on the staff. And I think that the diversity was something that stood out right away. I think I'm a cool guy, but I don't like to feel so special in a space that there's just one of me. And then you think about the other people not in the room. I grew up in a pretty diverse community in Uptown. So I've grown up with, I think, folks from all over the world. And I wasn't just thinking about Black people. I was like, wow, I know Chicago. I know the complexity and diversity. We don't have all the voices here that we need to have the conversations that are necessary and to honestly produce the work from those perspectives that I think equal a more equitable media environment. So I think the diversity was a big first big thing. I think that having the conditions to support and help people thrive, because people want more diversity, but they don't actually always change the conditions that they're at to ensure that people are set up for success and not being set up for failure, or not suffering microaggressions, or coming to a place that is not oriented themselves yet to the tough conversations around race, anti-racism, sexism, and so many other isms that we need to address. So I felt like there was a lack of I think, clear expectations for what success looks like and what people need to succeed. Goal setting, saying, what does a successful year look like for you? I think and then the conversations, we weren't really having open conversations about, reflecting on our structure, reflecting on our pay, reflecting on how we did our work and if that reflected our values and what were our values. I think that these were just things that were not, I won't claim that I'm the first person to surface them. I think they were conversations happening, but they weren't happening in the open with intentionality from leadership, in a sense where it was like, this is the direction we're all going in. Get on the bus, let's go, and we're in this together, and we need to do better. I think that another thing is the work. I think that the work was very good, very strong, but I didn't always center community and community voice and perspective. And also, we had a lot, a commentary section, a lot of opinions coming from folks, but a lot of the people writing were older, white civil rights lawyers. There wasn't a diversity of some of those first person and sort of op-ed sort of perspectives. And it felt like that was something that was a bad thing, because from what you mentioned, Lolly, that we're serving a community and focusing on issues that, very much are important to the lives of Black and Brown people in this city. So I think that we definitely needed to put more of an emphasis on listening and embedding the mandate in everyone's even job descriptions, that you are being a journalist means that you listen, you go where people are, and it's tough in a pandemic, but it also means that you are committed to building up this environment that's more diverse, equitable, inclusive, both in your office and in the work that you produce. And I think diversity of sources, or just even how you use characters and stories. And do we use, I've outlawed the word minority. We don't use that anymore. There's a lot of little things in our approach that I think was lacking. And I think one big thing I'll mention, the last thing is the pay. That it seems like nonprofits and some journalism orgs expect people to work for and earn what I don't think is a real living wage, and is not what they deserve. And I think, making $35,000, $40,000 a year to do what is such a stressful and intensive job is really a travesty. And we've had some success, I think, with those conversations, especially around pay and raising folks' compensation. But the work continues.
Absolutely, Ade, and much of what you have talked about really impacts me and the decisions that I make as a funder. I think you know that before I joined Field, I worked as a reporter for 17 years with the mainstream media, the Chicago Tribune. And oftentimes when I would go out on stories, I would be one of the only African Americans, and particularly one of the only Black women who was in the sort of journalism huddle, right? The huddle of reporters that are covering the court cases. And it definitely impacted how how I did my job, not just because I was the only in those huddles, but so many times when I went to the courthouse, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I would go to the courthouse, I'd get singled out to come in through security, whereas some of my colleagues wouldn't. Or when I would go to City Hall, I would get stopped by the police. So just how I got treated on a day-to-day basis started to really impact how I looked at how I did my job. So when I shifted over to funding, much like you, I was concerned about how I could use this position to really reinforce and really stand up and make sure that we were being equitable. And so one of the ways that I've been able to do that at Field is by when we are reaching out to organizations or organizations that are reaching out to us for funding is really ask those critical questions. Not just what does your staff look like, but what do the decision makers look like? What types of decisions do they make? How does that reflect our community? What about your board? How are you really enforcing equity? You pointed out salary, looking at salaries and seeing how much people are being paid before we make those types of decisions as funders of who we're going to give dollars and cents to, who we're going to actually hold up and support. You know, what does the equity look like within that organization? But just as you pointed out, also examining what does that content look like, right? Are you listening and working in partnership with the community? Does your journalism reflect what's important to the community and give information to the community, or does it continue to victimize them? Does it continue to single them out? I think Malkia made a really good point when she talked about if we want to really address structural racism, the first thing that we have to do is call it for what it is. And, you know, pointing out that there has been a long history within these organizations, not just of not having enough staff members that reflect the community, but also not giving those staff members that do reflect our communities the power that they need to tell stories accurately, to make sure that stories are placed properly, that it's not buried within the website or buried, within other content. And also, as you pointed out earlier, making sure that we're not just there to rob communities of their stories, but we are there to listen to them and empower their voices through the work that we do. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And I was going to ask you, I'm curious, you were a journalist and great journalist not that long ago. And I was going to ask you about how your experiences that kind of influence your approach as a funder, but I also think back to the experience I had going through trying to get funding from you, and I can check all those boxes that you try to check. I was amazed. It was like you gave me a tough time. You gave us a tough time, but I remember getting off a call and feeling so proud that there was someone like you who was actually in a position of power to provide support, but who wasn't just giving it easy like that, who understood some of these complexities. I want to ask though, you want to ensure your funding is equitable. And I know you have a system, you have a lot of things to do, but what are some of the challenges that you face in doing that still?
I will say really quickly, because you are one of my funding partners, you know that I am going sort of through the list and making sure that I interrogate organizations. But when I think about obstacles, Ade, honestly, one of the biggest obstacles is that the amount of funding that we are able to give and commit to organizations that are getting it right, when it comes to those organizations, it seems like the amount of funding is so modest in compared to so many organizations that we see that are not doing it right. And so if I could fix anything, if I could change anything, it would be to have more funding available to the organizations that are getting it right. Thank you so much for that question and for having this conversation with me today as we turn it back over to Malkia.
Oh, I'm just gonna say hallelujah though. More funding to get it right. That's what we talking about. And all the questions that you raise and the issues that you raise around pay equity and transparency, power. This is what we're here to talk about. So I want to thank both of you for being so generous with your time and with your truth. I appreciate you very much. And now I want to turn it over to Molly. Come on through, and Sandra. Molly, President, Independent Public Media Foundation. All right. Happy to have you here. Sandra Clark. All right. Vice President for News and Dialogue at WHYY. Yes, family. All right. Let me go ahead and turn it over to y'all. And I'm very excited to see what y'all going to talk about.
Thanks, Malkia. I'm so grateful to be here today in conversation with all the people on this panel. So many people I admire so much. I don't think Malkia knows this, but they're a sort of a personal hero of mine. So this is like a highlight of my year. And Sandy, you know that you're someone I deeply admire too. You've been in that position for what, like 5 years?
5 years.
Right?
Yeah.
And you've been spearheading efforts toward becoming a culturally competent newsroom and workplace. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk about what that means for WHYY, and if you could share some details of sort of the different paths, the different entry points that you're pursuing toward that cultural competency, and how those paths are like interconnected.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Molly. And it's great to be on this panel. Honestly, I think, Malkia's presentation, we could just put that on repeat over and over again, because that really sort of set the table for, how I've felt about journalism for a very long time as someone who's often felt like an outlier in newsrooms. I am, the title of this panel is Rebuilding Journalism, but the truth is I'm building on a house that's already built, right? And so, some of the work that I'm trying to do here it's really internal and external. If we can't acknowledge inequity, if we can't acknowledge that we don't know everything, and for journalism and the journalism culture in particular, where there's just a kind of elevated, self-congratulatory wokeness that's really embedded in our culture. I think it's important for us to, really come to this in a place of humility and understanding the historic path that's laid before us as news organizations after news organizations, do their deep audits and make their public apologies for, hundreds of years of damage, really. At HYY, I've tried to create a lot of different entry points to really addressing structural issues. And I don't think that we can just do work in the newsroom. If the entire organization is not changing, then the newsroom is just the newsroom, right? And so, we have audited our work, audited our sources. Not surprisingly, when we first started this work 4 years ago, we found, with a newsroom that's 80% white, guess what? Most of the sources we talked to were 80% of the sources we also talked to were white. And so if we want to talk about whose voices we're amplifying, how we're framing stories, who we're listening to and not listening to, I think that was very significant. And, through the support of Independence Public Media Foundation, we're also creating a community source database for our journalists, so that they are connected to people who aren't going to show up on the front pages anywhere, and whose voices often are not heard. We continue our source tracking, where I want, our staff to know who we are talking to. So we've taken a data approach to this, which is we present the information back to ourselves. And there's a lot of pushback on that. Like, that's not who we are. No, that can't be right. But if you're tracking it yourself, I think there's a level of accountability there. We've also, changed. We've invited the entire organization into our style committee, for example, that is run by an African-American woman and it makes a difference, I think, having a person of color really looking at some of these issues. And so the language that we use as an organization should be consistent. And so identifying kind of where those landmines are in terms of language, I think it's important for the whole organization to do that. We also have done a lot of work in the community, and including during the pandemic. I came to WHYY because I wanted to be closer to the public and really be held accountable, and then lead an organization into accountability. And so, my community engagement, managing editor for community engagement, he's somebody we actually model the whole project around. We created this project called the News and Information Community Exchange. We're working with really content creators across our whole, the city, somebody who has a newsletter that serves aging population, someone who has an online radio show. I mean, these are content creators. These are people putting out important information in their communities. and it's a mutual aid project. And so this group of content creators are telling us what are their needs, right? It's not about WHYY saying, hey, this is what we need from you. It's about them also saying, here's what we need. And so we've created a series of professional development workshops because that's what they've asked for. And we've also worked to integrate, their work within the work we do at WHYY. So we're always kind of, I think, having that, finding ways to, capture not just community voices, because, we can put community voices all over WHYY, but it's really, who are we doing this work for? Are we just doing it about people? Are we working for or with? And so I think honoring the work that's being done out there already, and that we are not the only game in town. We are not the ones most connected to many communities. I think that acknowledgement and sort of, orienting our mindset in the newsroom to that, I think is an important gap in closing some of these power trust gaps, with our communities. So there's a lot of work that is being done. But again, I'm building on a house that already exists.
Yeah, I want to go back a couple of steps. You talked about data. And as I was preparing for this panel, I reread some notes from a long conversation that we had back in March with you and your amazing team. And one of the things that jumped out at me from those notes is a conversation that we had about data and all of the creative ways in which you're collecting and centering data in your strategies. And I wanted to ask about that. Can you share details of that? Because I think it helps make it more concrete, both for the fellow journalists and in newsroom leaders listening into this conversation, as well as to funders who are trying to understand how to better support this kind of work and what it could look like when it's done well, much like the example we got from Lali and Ade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think collecting data is one thing, framing the collection is another, and how we analyze it is the third way, right? Because each of those can have their own inequities, built into them. The data, when somebody starts at WHYY, we ask, how do you self-identify? I mean, I think understanding who our staff is and how we see ourselves is really important. We ask, where do people live? So we know where the clusters of journalists live, and then every other piece of territory out there is probably not known and covered all that well. Again, with our source tracking, we're able to see, for example, what kinds of stories are we writing about? Are we writing a whole lot about local politics? That's often a space that's just full of a lot of information, but not as much analysis and real deep questioning. You can have 12 stories on, somebody who's thinking of introducing a bill. They thought about it, they talked to someone, maybe they're not going to do it, maybe they will. You can continue on those kind of incremental stories or not. Our data also shows us, are we talking to people who are impacted? Are we talking to people in communities? Or are we very expert heavy on people who are talking about people and their lives? So, that kind of nuance in the data is really important. And we meet with our teams. It's not just collecting and, we've built it, by the way, we've also built it into our performance evaluations because, and I'm just putting it out there, every time there's turnover, we're hiring people who already get it, as opposed to those we have to drag along. Those days are over. So, but that data is really important because it's kind of hard to argue with it, right? And then we're able to have deeper, more nuanced conversations about how we're framing stories, whose voices we're amplifying, and whether we're doing harm or whether we're doing good.
Yeah. I want to draw attention to a really recent report that Andrea Wenzel, who is a professor at Temple, wrote about your work, or specifically about the NICE, the News and Information Community Exchange work. It's called Mutual Aid in the Messy Middle, Pushing Public Radio Toward Anti-Racism. And it's fascinating. It's a really a fantastic report that I think really captures the complexity of this work and the I mean, that messy middle part is referring to sort of like negotiating all of this change, managing expectations, not just internally, but externally, and, challenging the norms of journalism. And it quotes some skeptical folks who are worried that this work is maybe trendy or too reliant on leaders like you and who are in a leadership position to push it forward. But what happens if you leave? And I don't want to get too far ahead, but at the same time, I want to ask you, how are you thinking about what you do? Like, how are you ensuring or trying to ensure, let me put it that way, that this work endures? Because, there are examples even in Philly of the Inquirer having done extensive work. I think it was in the early 2000s, and it all kind of fell apart when the finances fell apart at the Inquirer. One of the times that the finances fell apart at the Inquirer. So how are you thinking about putting systems in place, or, how do you help establish a culture, a different kind of culture from the one that already exists?
Yeah. Well, we are in the messy middle, but I think if we weren't messy, we're not really doing the work. And one of the reasons that I really appreciate Andrea, writing about our work and interviewing anonymously our staff about this work, which I think is really important because I want to know what's really out there. I want to know if people are bringing their mess to the table too, right? But I don't think we can get to any real kind of, acts of accountability, systems of accountability, if we don't know really how people feel about the work. Those are things that many will not even say to me, but I can feel it, right? As we're kind of trying to drag along. There's lots of work that has to be done. I mean, my number one goal is that if I were to leave WHYY, we have practices that are built in, and that, it's not me doing this alone. I mean, there's a lot of people, I have a news director that I've hired who's committed to that. I've got, editors. I mean, we talk about this. We have a literacy about it. Do we have equal commitment to it? No. But I'm seeing some signs. But this change we can't keep looking at everything as a marathon and this is the long game and it's down the road. I mean, people are passing us by. And as they pass us by, they're finding other avenues. They're finding other places to get information. At the same time, the positive is that I think there's just so much opportunity if you hire the right people. And one of the things about the pipeline that we're creating is it's not just a skills pipeline. We're creating a mindset pipeline, not everywhere. But I think that we have some people in place who really can continue to carry this work forward. But if the board's not on board, if the CEO's not on board, if, the marketing department, the development people, who are they talking to? I mean, this again has to be a whole enterprise kind of endeavor. Molly, one of the things I was thinking about when we were talking before was, here I am working at an institution that's over 60 years old. You are leading a foundation that is 3-4 years old, not even, right? Not even, and a foundation, really interestingly, that kind of, the roots of it came out of the Spectrum auction for WHYY, which was known for, right, diversity. It was known for this kind of storytelling. Does that mean that the foundation kind of, sort of is ready-made and has, racial equity already embedded, or, where's your work in this?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let me take one step back and just say that I think there's something sort of sweet and serendipitous about you and I having this conversation and thinking about the histories of the television stations, right? Because WYBE, which I was not a part of, I lived in Philly when it existed, was this sort of smaller alternative public television station that was committed to centering community and community stories and putting the public back in public media on the air. And they eventually sold their Spectrum, as you mentioned, and transitioned to a private foundation, which I now have the privilege to lead. And I think, we've been making grants for 2 2 years and a few months. I think, we're clear that we want to prioritize the people in the communities that have been denied access to capital and other resources and networks that philanthropy offers, but that we're still, interrogating what the specific needs are in Philadelphia, in the region where we might have the most impact, how to get to that impact. And I think we also have a lot of work to do to make sure we understand the systems that we're operating in, and that we institute ways to be held accountable. Because as you know, philanthropy, there's very little accountability in philanthropy. We kind of have all of the power, because if grantees or prospective grantees speak out, that can be held against them. So I think it's really important for us to build that into our work, and we have that work ahead of us still.
Yeah, we talked for quite a bit about this last year and a half, and particularly, this period, post the murder of George Floyd, and kind of the movement that happened. Kind of describe, internally what was going on in Independence Public Media. You said that you came out of that as a better leader. What do you mean by that?
I think you should, maybe ask my team that question, but I think, so I have a team, there are 4 of us, it's me and it's 3 Black women. And I feel like it was such a gift to be able to have conversations with them during that time last summer. And I think maybe if I did one thing right as a leader, it was that I hopefully created a space where we could be honest and share like what we needed from one another and how I could be supportive of them. And I have tried to do that in every way and take up less space and, be in solidarity with them. But it was, I'll be honest, as a sort of as a white woman in a very white field, and as a leader, which is, I think, a sort of can be a lonely existence. It was not easy to navigate, and I'm still working on it and doing my best, because I think, to Malkia's point, and this is the last thing I'll say, Malkia, I know we're out of time here, is, you talked about this not being about individuals, right? It's about systems change. But I think as a leader of a foundation with some level of power and enormous resources, I see it as my job to do the personal work in order to do the organizational work, in order to get to the systems change work. And so I think that's right. That's where I am.
To me, that's right. And that's true for all of us who are engaged in the work of social change. We know that if rebuilding journalism requires a shift in power, then leadership matters, right? And we also know that leaders have the opportunity to transform the economic base as well as the political conditions. And so we know that so long as journalism is held hostage by a corporate economic base, we're subjecting it to an economic base that presupposes the disposability of everyday people. So what you're doing day to day, both of you, in your work, is making the kinds of changes that will lead us into the democracy that we deserve. So I want to say thank you to both of you for this conversation. And I want to turn it over at this point. I want to turn it over to Karen Runlet from the Knight Foundation to close us out. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Malkia and Molly and Sandra. And thanks to everybody who listened and showed up for all these conversations today. Again, I'm Karen Runlet, and I'm a journalism director at Knight Foundation. I think that we just heard news leaders tell us about how they're trying to make systemic change at their organizations. And I think we also heard leaders in philanthropy talk about accountability and who's holding philanthropy accountable. We're talking about really powerful and important and rich and huge ideas here about systems change. And I know that there are funders that are listening to this. It's very new to them. And I just wanted to go back to at least some of the things that that are very practical from this, to even start to get at this. You know, Sandy and Molly were just both talking about metrics. And actually, so was Lolly in her conversation. You know, are you asking whether these teams are diverse? Are you asking whether the leadership is diverse? Are you asking whether the board is diverse? I can tell you that was not something that we were always doing at Knight Foundation, and now there are metrics right in our applications. We're tracking our own work. I will also say, Malkia had specifically, I think it was wealthy white donors who prioritize their priorities versus the priorities of movements. You know, are you challenging yourselves around those questions? How much are you asking of your, are you donors of your grantees, excuse me, of your grantees? Are you putting too much in the way of their actually doing the work to get the funding? And I was really, I very much like the question about, is this trendy? How does this work last? It really does last by us having systems in place. I do want to say, even at Knight right now, we're having these conversations, and obviously, well, we've been having them in the journalism program, but we're having them as a foundation too. So look at your metrics, look at the body of work that you've been funding thus far, interrogate it, see who you've been funding. What are the patterns there? Are those patterns really good for community? Are they the favored sons and daughters? Are there new organizations that you should be considering in your work? I think philanthropy, in order to get the funding right for journalism, philanthropy has to get its entire funding categories and funding criteria righted as well. So thank you again for listening today. This all starts again tomorrow at noon. At noon, Media